I'm going to survive.
Okay.
I'm really old and have been around forever.
That's what I'm going to say. Here's Dr. Grayson, who's really old and has been around forever.
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone. We will give everybody a few minutes to join. As always, we are excited to have you and excited to have today's guest for Wednesday's Lunch and Learn. As many of you know, for those who are joining, please make sure you put who you are and where you're joining from so that we can be sure to say hi. And of course, throughout today's session, we always ask that you'll submit questions, comments, things you would like Dr. Grayson or myself to cover. We will try our best to do that. A couple of updates, as always, that we want to hop into. First and foremost, it's important to remember that today's entire session is intended to be educational and therapeutic. However, it's not intended to replace therapy. So we really want to encourage you to be seeing your own clinician and your own providers to get appropriate treatment and resources for your own specific needs. One of the things we talk a lot about is that treatment for OCD is individualized and should continue to be. And so while we'll do our best to give some feedback, to give some of our own personal and professional experience, we really encourage you to be seeing your own clinician. Of course, this is not a crisis hotline. If you're feeling unsafe or suicidal, we want you to take the steps you need to take to keep yourself safe. The International OCD Foundation and these live streams are not intended to help in times of crisis, but there are people and places who are. So please make sure, if feeling that way, you can go to your local emergency room, call 911, or call the suicide prevention line at 1-800-273-8255. Of course, remember, for those of you who are joining outside of the U.S., your direct contact information in times of crisis is different, so please make sure to figure out what those are. We have so many upcoming live streams, so many amazing things that are coming up, but most importantly, what I'm most excited about, and I'm sure Dr. Grayson is as well, is our International OCD Foundation Conference. So it is going to be coming to you live virtually in just a couple days. So this Friday, we will kick off and launch our second annual online conference. One of the things that I candidly, I think John and I would both tell you, we're pretty, we wish we could be in person. I think that it is
so much
awesome. And I'm looking forward certainly to that in Denver of next year. However, I don't know if a lot of you know, but IOCDF had more attendees last year at our online conference than ever before. We had over 3,000 attendees. And one of the things I was talking actually last night to my dad about is, while I do wish we could be in person, there is a lot of benefit to a virtual conference for OCD, especially for folks who are homebound and may not be able to attend an in-person conference. They can attend from the comfort of their home. Maybe it's not comfortable, but you can attend from your home and hopefully be able to get some help, some insight, and helpful education. Any thoughts you have about the conference? You've been going for a long time, Dr. Grayson. Thoughts or feedback that you have of why it's important for people with OCD?
I think the conference, and this worked out last year, even though it was virtual. I think one of the most amazing things for sufferers, where else can you go where you're surrounded by 2,000 to 3,000 people and you don't have to explain anything? Like, you can just say it and like they all understand. And I think that's an incredible feeling. It's such a supportive atmosphere where there's so much help, and you get to see a lot of people who are doing well. Many people with OCD don't see others. So you will see people who are suffering, but you see others doing well, so you can see that there's a way out. I just wanted to mention the other thing that this conference, because one of the great things about the live conference is people coming, they could, there are a zillion OCD experts there, and you could grab them and talk to them. That's a little harder here, but we actually do have something, and you should be able to find it. We call it the Living Room Brigade. We have 20-minute consultations where you can talk to an OCD expert for free, and you can sign up for those. They're listed somewhere in the conference brochure, and I believe in the recent email. So even that experience of being able to just grab somebody who's a professional just to share some ideas. It is not therapy, but it is a place to find out some information and get some advice.
Absolutely. I know I'm excited for it, and I've already got about 6 emails of people who I'll be meeting with, which is really exciting. And so this, for those of you that this may be your first time attending the conference, one of the most beautiful things about the conference, as Dr. Grayson mentioned, is the community, but it's also really the only conference that exists where almost every professional in the OCD world parents and family members of people with OCD and then individuals are all together in one place. And so being able to have those hallway conversations and being able to grab somebody, a professional to say, hey, I have a question, it's really valuable. And so we do our best, even in the online format, to still make that possible. So definitely be sure you attend and go to IOCDF.org or onlineOCDconference.org for more information, because I can promise you it will be an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to connect with others. So let's hop into today. Dr. Grayson, I don't think you need an introduction, so I'm not really going to give you one. But what I will say is Dr. John Grayson is one of the best, if not the best, OCD clinician that exists. He's somebody who wrote Freedom from OCD, which is, in my opinion, the best book out there for OCD, and I recommend it to everybody, all of our patients, certainly here at McLean Houston. And one of the things, John, that I love the most about you is that I think you have this innate ability to connect with patients with OCD on a level where you're able to have empathy, have understanding, maybe despite living with it, but also push us in ways that we need to be pushed. And I think there's no better person to be talking about uncertainty, to be talking about how ERP works, what it should actually look like in practice, and of course, to talk about how we can increase our motivation for treatment than you. So thank you for joining. We're so excited, as always, to have you here.
Lord knows if I'll be able to live up to all of that, Liz. I will remind you that you can't call me Dr. Grayson.
You always say that. I still can.
I can call you Dr. McIngvale if you prefer. Motivation. I think there are a lot of different parts of treatment where motivation it's always critical. But I mean, I think it plays different parts of treatment that require different things to do for motivation. And I know you're going to agree with what I'm about to say. I think before anybody can begin doing exposure and response prevention, they need to be working on the goal of treatment. And one of the things I find really incredibly upsetting is I see many people first of all, there's all the people who see somebody who doesn't know how to work with OCD, so that's just horrible. But even when they work with somebody who supposedly knows how to work with OCD, and I'll say, so what? Do you know what the goal of treatment is? And they won't know. Because as near as I can tell, almost all forms of OCD involve trying to be certain about something, wanting to be 100% certain. And, the reason that sufferers can't do that has to do with a research fact that research has shown us the only people who are absolutely certain are stupid. So people with OCD do not fall into that category. So the goal of treatment is learning to live with uncertainty. And, so it's not like you have to know how to do that, because I think if somebody come in like, oh, I want to live with uncertainty now, then why are you coming? You've got it. So it's a learning process, but I see many people who that's where their treatment fall apart. Nobody tried to make sure they were doing that. So I think the very first step in treatment is establishing, is that the goal you have, or do we have to help you accept that goal? Many people, that's like wanting to know the first session, they get it. It's like, oh, wow. I've never done that. Other people, it could take many sessions or a few months. But why would I start doing exposure if they don't accept that? Because that is the world we're stuck living in. Some things are more likely, some things are less likely. If I'm afraid of getting cancer, there's no way somebody can tell me that won't happen. So how am I going to cope with it if that happens? It doesn't matter how badly I don't want it. If it happens, I'm going to have to cope with it. So I have to imagine how I'm going to cope with it. But if I go to something that seems less likely, like getting abducted by aliens, it's the same thing. How would you cope with the worst? Whether it's abducted by aliens, are you straight, are you gay, do you love your husband, are you going to kill your spouse, are you a pedophile? All of them, what would you do? And we never allow a person to say, oh, if that happens, I'd kill myself. And we don't let them say that for two reasons. One, I really do not like working with dead people because they are good at response prevention, but they never do the exposures I assign. And the second one is that if I say I'm going to kill myself, that's a way of me not having to think about how I would actually cope. So in a sense, I wonder if the consequence happens that you're condemned to life so that you have to cope. If you were to get cancer, do you want your last year to be as good as it can be, or do you want it to be more awful? So I think the very first step in motivation is knowing what I'm choosing to do. After that, then we can start really working on motivation.
I love it. And I think that, I don't know the numbers, but I could guess at them. But I actually think that this is the pitfall that most clinicians fall into. And so for those of you listening, I really want you to hear what we're saying today. We are not saying that you shouldn't start doing ERP and that ERP isn't useful and that it doesn't have the most value in terms of outcomes for OCD. But what we're saying is that jumping into ERP before you've accepted the goal of treatment can actually be where we get stuck in ERP. One of the things that I hear all the time from patients is, well, ERP doesn't work for me. ERP, I've tried it. It's not for me. It doesn't work. Or, I've done a lot of different ERP. How is what you're doing going to be different? And I think this actually, John, is the missing piece. I think that this is the part where we can jump in, we can do exposures, we can do ERP for your certain, symptoms or whatever you're currently dealing with. And even if you haven't totally bought into the uncertainty model, it'll probably kind of work, right? You'll be able to see, okay, like slowly I'm not afraid of that because I continued to do those exposures and engage in response prevention. And so the fear of that particular thing went down. But I often see patients who do this kind of like ERP only for our targeted symptoms compared to accepting the goal of treatment and really accepting the concept of ERP and why we're doing it. These are the patients that I find always come back and say, now it's something new and I don't know how to deal with this, or I didn't get treatment for this type of OCD. And often we talk about, those of us with OCD talk about OCD being this like game of whack-a-mole where you're constantly just fighting symptom after symptom. And, one of the things I hear most commonly is, how can I be motivated if I'm going to always have to do this? People feel like accepting a diagnosis of OCD means we have to accept that we're always going to suffer. They often feel that, well, how, like, okay, so I feel motivated in this moment to deal with contamination, but if it's going to be something else and something else is going to come up and feel stronger, like, why would I want to keep doing this if I constantly have to do ERP? Can you spend a little bit of time talking about how, A, that's really a myth and that doesn't have to be the case, but B, how can we help patients accept that? Because I think if you accept that you don't have to accept a life of suffering, motivation will on its own go up.
Well, and I think the point you raise, a lot of people, as I don't have to tell you, that you always have OCD, and that periodically you have to deal with it and you're slipping, all those things. But that is not saying I'm basically always suffering and every day is a painful, horrible set of exposures that I'm just going to have to white knuckle my way through to get to the next level. That if I'm accepting uncertainty, that I have lots of good days and days where it doesn't bother me, So, I do think there's a group where they just want it to be gone. And so that is an acceptance issue of like, oh no, you aren't going to have to keep dealing with it. But, and you speak to this better than I, Liz, but right, keep dealing with it doesn't mean, means lots of the time I'm free. And, I get to that point where, it's a little bit of a pain in the neck, but, I always try to tell clients, do not do anything that I tell you to do unless I've convinced you. And I think part of the uncertainty is the convincing, because, if you have pedophile OCD and somebody's just doing exposure with you and you're looking at pictures, doing all this, and I would argue, well, like, how's that helping you? Because it's not like that convinces you you're not a pedophile. So although I'm learning the function and everything, it's like, why is that going to work? If I'm doing with the idea that I'm going to take this risk, I want to get used to thinking I don't have, as near as I can tell, a current desire, but that tells me nothing about tomorrow. And how would I try to cope with it? Sometimes I'll ask clients, suppose you woke up tomorrow and you actually knew having sex with a 5-year-old would be great. Like you wake up and you know, like, oh my God, that would be terrific. What would you do? And people get pretty upset. And I point out like, well, doesn't mean you have to sleep with 5-year-olds. I mean, do you ever see attractive people walk down the street and is your habit that anybody's attractive, you walk up to them and say, hey, will you sleep with me? Generally, you show some control. So you're able to do that. And they might tell me how terrible that person is. And it's like, okay. So if there is, if there are people who have those feelings and never engage in them, should we get rid of them? They're a little less sure. And if this was your sister or brother who came to you with this and saying, I have these feelings, like I would never act on them, but like, oh my God, I don't know what to do about them. Would you basically tell them, they should die and crawl in a corner or learn to cope? So even in a situation like that, we're talking about like, okay, how would you try to cope with that? To which they say, well, what if I actually did it? And they're like, oh, if we actually did it, we'd have to talk about how we're going to help you not do it again and your guilt and have you, make a lot of changes. But it's not like life stops. Something happens afterwards. And so having that concept and having the idea of like, none of us know anything, I don't have a current plan to slice and dice my wife, Kathy, tonight, but I'm not planning on going crazy because one doesn't plan that. So I actually don't know if I'm going to do that to her tonight. I do know that I have knives all over the house, but hopefully I don't do that to her. She doesn't do it to me. I just hope that won't happen, and somebody says, well, you don't have OCD. It's like, yeah, but that doesn't mean it won't happen. And the thing that's so sad about the feeling of certainty is how useless it is. I mean, it is a great feeling to enjoy, but let's face it, when people get married on their wedding day, they're expecting to be married forever. In our country, that feeling of certainty is wrong for 50% of the people. They end in divorce. So it's not like the feeling predicts anything. So we're trying to get used to all kinds of things happen in life. And the best I can do is try to cope with what seems to be going on right now and to cope with it. I mean, can you imagine you and I, Liz, we're living in this world where everything's going along pretty well. And then like one day, suddenly there's this worldwide pandemic that screws up everything, right? Like that stuff doesn't happen really.
Not supposed to happen. we didn't think it would happen.
We didn't think it would happen. But, safety is a probability statement, not a fact. Low probability things happen and all we can do is cope with them. We can't prevent them.
I love it. I'm writing that down. That safety is a probability statement, not a fact. I think that's really important. And this actually brings me to the next question I wanted to ask you today is I had someone say to me recently, Liz, one of the differences or one of the things that they feel like they struggle with is that people without OCD, while they may not be certain, they actually said, hey, while someone without OCD might accept uncertainty, they oftentimes have a feeling of certainty.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that they were saying or asking is, how do people with OCD get that feeling of certainty, right? We know the feeling is wrong. We know it's false. We know that this morning I had meetings starting at 8 a.m. and I booked my calendar and I felt pretty certain I was going to get here and make it to work, but I had no real idea, right? I'm taking lots of risks by the time I wake up to being able to show up for that meeting that could prevent me from attending, but I felt confident, right? I didn't have any reason to believe I wasn't going to make it to those meetings. Where for people with OCD, when we're talking about our current OCD triggers, right, not only do we want certainty, we don't feel any level of certainty. We feel the opposite. We feel extremely uncertain, right? And that anxiety is all based around the feeling of uncertainty compared to the false, even if it's false, right? The false feeling of certainty people without OCD have. So what do you tell those patients when they're wanting that feeling of certainty?
Well, I'm thinking 3 or 4 things that you're speaking. The first one is, of course, as you noted, people with OCD do get to have that feeling of certainty, just not in the areas where they have a problem. And I always tell anybody who's suffering from OCD that when you overcome OCD, you won't be normal. You will be better than normal. Because, I think in the so-called normal world, we could artificially break it into 3 groups. Those people who cope with uncertainty, those people who can't cope with uncertainty, and the bigger, larger group that's really good at denial. OCD kind of knocks out that middle goal. So you might want to have that denial, be in that denial group, but OCD offers you heaven or hell. So you've tried hell, and so heaven might be the consolation prize, but the truth is nothing is certain. The truth is that living with uncertainty would be good for everybody. Our clients who had gone through treatment well handled the pandemic much better, because part of OCD, when it hits you, is very similar to what happens to somebody in a trauma. And what I mean is, all women, for instance, know that they can be raped. But, you don't take it seriously. I mean, it could happen, fine, but, you don't worry about it. And so when that happens to a woman, and people are talking about the trauma, everybody's focusing on the horrific aspects of the experience, and they are horrific. But there's another key part of the trauma that's critical. That woman, she's now being asked to be happy in a world where she can really be raped. It's no longer like she gets that nice little innocence, like it won't happen. It's not like you can say, like, well, it won't happen again, because the thought is like, it shouldn't have happened the first time. Helping somebody live happily in that world, that's difficult. And so OCD, there's always that question, how can I live in a world where X can be true? And a sentence that goes right back to the treatment motivation, because the question I'm going to ask the person, because I'm saying to you, okay, I want you to live in this world where, the nightmare can happen, and that sounds terrifying. And the question that's going to be motivating, hopefully, is why would you take this risk? That is the question we have to answer to have motivation. Because if I can't tell you why it's worth taking the risk, then you'd be crazy to not take it. To take it. And there are a number of general categories to that answer. The very first one, which is really compelling, you don't have a choice. There's no world where something's impossible. Really unlikely, but unlikely is not 100% or 0%. So one reason is that. The second one's a little bit easier. What have you lost to OCD? How's it hurt you? How's it hurt your family? And let's look at that in all the horrible, painful ways we can come up with. Because what we have is that if I give in and refuse to take the risk, life will continue to be hell. And what's really sad is two things. One, it's going to continue to be hell whether the bad thing happens or not. It might never happen. So I will lose my entire life out of fear of something that might never happen. And equally horrible, your rituals don't work. They may not really lessen the odds of whatever it is you're doing. I can always find a way where somebody's rituals are not really sufficient. They're not good enough. So it's kind of like, well, you need to get crazier or get better, because there's a person you want to be inside, and he or she is not going to exist if you're giving into OCD. So we want to help the person become who they want to be, and we have to know them well enough to be able to point out why that's a possibility for them. Because certainly a lot of people, when they've been taken down by OCD, they don't believe in themselves because they don't see all of themselves. They just see one side, so everybody else sees it. Some people say, oh, yeah, I know I look real good. I put up a fake, I put up this great facade. I'm sorry, that great facade is an incredible amount of work and makes you an amazing multitasker, that you can do that when you're suffering, so it's not fake. It's just, I don't want you to have to rely on that facade all the time, but it represents strength. And certainly, in terms of perseverance, oh my God, the way you persevere in your symptoms, we know you can persevere and make yourself crazy. Let's have you persevere and help you get well. So I think a lot of motivation has to do with, why would I take that risk?
100%. And I think the thing I go back to often, and that I love that you just said, right, is that you actually can't have both. You can't you can't have OCD and the search. You can't be holding on to the feeling of certainty and have a fulfilling life, right? Like it's literally not possible. And I think the biggest thing I always hear people say is, well, Liz, I do these rituals because of my values, right? If I don't do these rituals, I'm going against my values. So many times OCD tricks us to believe that like, oh, like I'm only doing these because these things are so important to me, because they're so valuable. But what we know is that doing OCD rituals actually takes us the furthest away from our values. We can't have our values and have a values-based life that we're living and have OCD and a search for certainty, right? Because the more you search for certainty, you can't actually achieve it, right? That's impossible. And so all it does is take you away from these important things in life. And I think what you're saying is, how do we help our patients, or those of you that are patients, how do you help yourself decide what you want, right? And what's important to you? Because I don't think any of you would say OCD is important. And
Right.
I think the things that are important, it's going to be hard to succeed and to have them the way you want them if you're giving into OCD.
Yeah. You did remind me of a David Bowie quote.
What's that?
The search for certainty is the road to insanity.
I'm writing it down too. The search for certainty is the road to insanity.
David Bowie.
It's true, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
right. Yeah. Well, because everybody, they might wish for it. I mean, one of the things that's wonderful about people with OCD is they're illogical. And the symptoms are illogical. The only thing is somebody might be going after something low probability, but it also makes this argument very logical, if not upsetting, because the individual knows there's no certainty. They're just trying to run from that. So we're a pain in the neck pointing out there's no place to run. I had one fellow who was afraid of going crazy. He lets me talk about him. And my first session, I upset him a lot. I said, well, our goal of treatment is to have you risk going crazy. And he just spent the last 30 years trying to not go crazy. And he had other, supposedly good ERP therapists who did exposure, but nobody ever said that to him. But that was what was going to free him. It's like, I point out your rituals, sorry, they don't prevent you from going crazy. This could happen to you. What do you want to do when this happens? What do you mean when it happens? If it happens? I said, oh, it might be an if, but sure. But if it happens, what do you want to do? And it's very scary to have to admit anything can happen. And a lot of people will feel depressed when they feel that. It's a good depression. It is the beginning of mourning, of accepting that I can't have what I want, that it feels like I'm asking you to live the second best life. It is second best because it's definitely not as good as the fantasy life you imagine. But it does have the advantage over a fantasy of being possible. And the thing about the fantasy life is because you can't be 100% certain. It's really frantic because this can't happen. I got to do these things to make sure it doesn't happen. I'm trying to do things to make sure it doesn't happen. I know it can happen. What about this and that? Whereas I have to live in a world that can happen. And it does feel sad. Acceptance sucks. I have to accept something I don't want. But it doesn't really suck in the long run. In the long run, it's like what allows me to live in a world that exists. It's like that first reason. Why would I take this risk in treatment? Oh, yeah, I don't have a choice. This thing I want is maybe possible, but it's not likely. And if it's possible, it's not likely forever.
So when we think about acceptance, I do think that a lot of people with OCD, when they hear acceptance with OCD, they think that means accepting OCD forever, and which it does to an extent. But what a lot of people interpret that to be is I need to accept I'll suffer forever, right? And what I think that I hear you saying is actually we're accepting uncertainty. And there comes a grieving process with that because you're giving up everything you've held on to for so many years, right? Or however much time that you've been engaging in OCD behaviors, right? We're truly freeing ourselves, giving up the notion that we can have certainty for anything.
Yeah. I was working with a woman who was really doing very well in treatment. And one day she said, and she heard the uncertainty, but one day she in treatment said, for my whole life, ever since I've been a little girl, I always have this feeling like ultimately, like I could fix anything. Like if I got cancer and they told me it's incurable, I'd find a cure. And I said, oh, so how would you do that? Well, I searched on the internet. I said, okay, so there's a lot of garbage on the internet. How would you be able to tell the garbage from the good stuff when obviously all the doctors you've been seeing can't figure it out? And for some reason on this day, it hit her. And she was like, but what is there? How do you do that? What do I have? I said, all you have is the odds. And I pointed out, like, this isn't an idea I'm giving you. This is like terrifying. We just exploded your entire system. So it's not just an idea. This changes 30 years of assumptions, 20 years of assumptions that you've had about how life works. And although it didn't work, we've taken this away from you. So this is really big. And the next week when she came back, she said, all week I was kind of wandering around in days just going, the odds, in a good way. But, she was kind of taking in like, and it was great and terrible. The great thing is like, it's not your responsibility anymore. It's not like, yeah, you can fix everything and you're screw up because you keep failing. And it was terrible because you don't control everything. Things will happen. How will you cope with them? And this was just in time because a lot of sudden awful things hit her in her life that she could then handle that maybe 2 weeks earlier she would not have been able to.
And I think that it's interesting because one of the other questions I get a lot, I keep saying a lot of questions I get a lot, right? But the main ones are, what was like my aha moment? Like people will say to me, Liz, when did things click for you, or when did you get it? And
this will be the first time I'm hearing this, Liz. I am on the edge of my seat at this one. Next time I'll know you've said it before, but I'm right now like I want to hear this.
I don't know if it's that groundbreaking. But what's surprising to a lot of people is that I think the assumption is that I had that aha moment in the first 10 to 15 years of treatment. A lot of people think, well, you made it through high school, you made it, because I obviously like never thought I'd graduate high school. I made it through high school. I made it through college. I got my PhD. And people think, well, you must have had that. You must have been really managing OCD in a high level to be able to have had that success. And I will tell you, that's literally not the case. I don't think things clicked for me until the past 5 years. I think that I spent the first 15 years of treatment always treating my symptoms, not buying into the bigger picture, not understanding the model and the application of it every day, but that I really had to fully commit. I had to choose to commit. I started using a lot of your language years ago where I quit saying, right, I have to do this ritual. I have to wash my hands. And, I'm choosing to wash my hands. And these subtle shifts over time, for a while, all I did was treat my symptoms with ERP. One symptom would come up, I'd do ERP. I'd struggle more. I'd go to therapy 3 times a week. And then I'd go back to once a week and then back down to twice a month or whatever I needed. But it was constantly like, how am I doing today? And what's my ERP going to look like for today? And I think I was feeling exhausted all the time. Even if I managed my symptoms enough to function, it was exhausting because it was like you were fighting full force, having to bring your best game every single day. And in the past 5 years, I think I really realized, a lot of the fighting is a choice that I'm making. Mm-hmm. I can choose to surrender to uncertainty or surrender sometimes a little bit, which is what I did, right? I did enough. I constantly would do enough exposures to be able to function, but I was accepting functioning versus freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really big piece. So some people have heard me say, well, so we shouldn't accept, we should be able to function. I'm like, no, that's not what I'm saying, right? But what I'm saying is, what are you accepting? What are you fighting for? Are you fighting for functioning in the sense that, like, okay, if I can just maintain a job, that means things are successful. And that even if I'm struggling all the time and I'm having to deal with ERP, if I can hold a job, then that means like things are going well. But what you're accepting is like a crappy life, right? You're accepting that like functioning and surviving is all I'm ever going to get because I have OCD. And at some point you have to choose as a patient to buy into the whole concept, to accept uncertainty across the board so that you can truly have freedom, because you can't have full freedom if you're still holding on to any of it.
Can I ask you 2 personal questions?
Please.
First of all, it's kind of a repeat of the question. Was there a time though where it kind of became clear of like, oh wait, I've actually got to do this? Like, was there an aha month or an aha 2 months or the day where it had been coming along for a while and suddenly like, oh wait, yeah, I realize where I'm headed now. Like, so was there a moment like that?
I'll give you the truth because I can't lie to you. And I think this will be shocking for a lot of people because I've done well and I'm proud of where I am in my career and that I've been in this position longer than this has been the case, but it didn't happen until I got pregnant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there was something about having a child. I think that I've always had this fear of, can I have a kid? Because what if they have OCD?
Mm-hmm.
And for the first time in my life, when I was entering a new stage, I realized like, I can't have both. I can't have freedom and be present and have the life I want with a kid. I don't get that time back.
Mm-hmm.
And have OCD. And so candidly, the last year is when I 100% accepted it across the board. I had always done it here and there on occasion, right, and you'd have some freedom, but it wasn't like I fully leaned in and fully accepted it.
Nothing like children to turn your life upside down. Before I ask the other question, I just wanted to give you a piece of parenting advice. Being a parent means that you are always guilty, because every decision you make, you're making one of 2 mistakes. You're overprotective, and that's why they're messed up and can't handle anything. You weren't protective enough, and that's why they broke their leg. No middle ground. No middle ground. They survive by luck. So
it seems.
So don't look to be guilt-free. It's not happening.
Okay.
It's not even your OCD. That's just normal. The second thing, and I don't know if this applies to you, but I know for many sufferers, they accept functioning because on top of everything else, for reasons that honestly make no sense, they don't think they deserve to be happy. So they're accepting something as low as functioning because it's not even like happiness is beyond me. That would be a sad thing, but it's like, I don't deserve happiness. So I don't know if that, I know you've seen that. I don't know if that was part of your history at any point.
I mean, I think that it turned into that. I think it started with truly not believing it was possible. Mm-hmm. I think that from the outside, I always would have people and hear people say, well, you must be doing so great now. Like, look at you now, right? You graduated college, or you got your PhD, or you work in the field, or whatever, right? And so these were these like external points or some sort of external ways that people could say like, oh, this is evidence that you're now doing great. Mm-hmm. And what those of us with OCD know, right, and this working with so many, is that we can function at a really high level. We can have, and I knew how to talk the talk, right? But are you applying it across the board all the time? And now I don't want anyone to hear me saying, just within a year ago, I was suffering all the time and ritualizing all the time. That wasn't the case. I was still doing ERP actively, but I was kind of doing ERP all the time. It felt like all I had to do was ERP. Now I don't actually have to feel, I don't even feel like I'm doing ERP all the time, because I've just accepted all of it across the board that it doesn't feel like ERP, right? When I'm holding my child and I have a sexual intrusive thought, which I have, which triggers me and can raise my anxiety a little bit, in that moment, I can choose to fully lean in. And then throughout the next few days, if that's on my mind, I know what I can do to where it's never going to bother me, or some of the few subtle things I could do that would give it power. So it's a learning process for all of us.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think the goal, there was another woman who was in treatment, and I'm not going to do the whole story right now, but she was a remarkable story. But in the support group one day, she announced, "I have no regrets about having OCD. I mean, I am really glad I have it under control now. But all those years I lost, I don't regret them. And the reason I don't regret them is I like who I am right now." You know, so I might have been some other great person if I conquered this earlier, but I don't know her. I know me, and I want to be me. And there was suffering, but I also think I learned things. I think it's why I'm empathetic and a whole bunch of other things. And, you know, and sometimes I slip, and yeah, I am not thrilled when I slip and I have to do the work, but I kind of just view it as practice in keeping me sharp. And I just think it's important for anybody who's suffering to realize OCD sucks and it interferes, but you're not defective, you know, and if you're going to love yourself, you don't have to love all the garbage you went through. You have to, it's important to accept the good things about you came from that.
Yep.
You know, so
that's right. I couldn't agree more. And I talk a lot about the fact that, like, my favorite quote in general, right, I was going to say right now, is without my suffering, I wouldn't know my strength. And I truly believe that. You know, do I wish I didn't have to go through 15 years of the hell I went through to get to where I am? Of course, right? Like, no one wants that. Never. None of us would want OCD on our worst enemy, right? We know that. But it doesn't mean we didn't learn something from it. It doesn't mean there wasn't strength that was built during the process. And I talk often about our ability to turn our pain into purpose. And I think people with OCD, not just are they better than the norm in the sense of are they able to approach things, but they're stronger than the norm also. So let's hop into questions, if that's okay. I know we have a couple. So starting, Jess, at 11:13, Charlene said, autism and OCD. Does ERP work when the brain is even more rigid? So I think this is a great question, and would love to hear your feedback, John, about really when someone's living with a diagnosis of ASD and OCD, and we see kind of the difficulty with flexibility, how do those patients engage in ERP appropriately, and are they able to accept uncertainty?
Yes, they are. And, you know, there's kind of the social issues with ASD, and as well as the rigidity. And this might seem really strange, but actually you can teach somebody the rules for being flexible, which sounds a little crazy. Wait, there are rules I can follow that make me flexible. That doesn't sound that, but there are rules to learn how to be flexible and how to incorporate flexible challenges. There's a woman in Northern California, Michelle Garcia Winner, who talks about social thinking, and, you know, it helps people with ASD to learn to be more flexible and how to deal with that part of life. And so, so the rigidity can be overcome. And I think with ASD, it's like all problems and all people, it affects people differently. So some people, it interferes with OC treatment and I have to work it. I have some people with ASD where, in a way, they're so good with rules that if they understand why this doesn't make sense, they just stop. You're kind of the way you wish somebody, but I have to be in their system to understand that and help them do that. So it introduces a bunch of challenges with regard to treating that person, but none of them are impossible. It's just a different, you know. What you said earlier, everybody has an individual treatment. So this is part of their individual treatment. But yeah, it's not a sentence like, oh yeah, that's nothing we can do about that. No, that's actually really workable.
Right. So it is workable, but it is different, right? And I think that sometimes understanding, really teasing apart the function of the behaviors is important too, right? Oftentimes, if we're looking at things only with an OCD lens, we might say, oh, these are OCD contamination behaviors, or these are certain OCD behaviors where they may be more of an ASD behavior that looks like OCD, and understanding that functioning is important as well, because if we're approaching something only from an OCD lens, but there's an ASD kind of rigidity or rules or norms that exist there, we do need to approach it differently. Next question at 11:13 from Mary. Can you address for us, John, real event OCD and how it's treated?
I'm so glad somebody asked that, because it's a great question and a terrible question. Because the assumption in that question is that when I talk about living with uncertainty, I'm playing a game. That I'm not, it's like, oh yeah, we're going to pretend that might really happen. It's like, no, I'm dead serious. This might really happen. How would you cope with it? So treatment of real event OCD is no different. Yes, it happened, or it might happen again. It doesn't matter. Coping with uncertainty means I have to cope with something that happened. Did that person, and again, depends, are we worried about a real event coming or a real event that happened that I'm either having trouble coping with the fact that it happened, or I'm worried that it will happen again? Okay, both of those are possible. And, I had one woman who had GERD, a stomach problem, and her OCD was focused, and she was terrified of getting GERD. I mean, her life was ruled by it. And our first session is like, well, this is going to happen again. And she's like, what do you mean? It's like, I mean, you've got stomach issues. Like, this is happening again. How are you want to handle it differently? Because actually, as bad as it was actually worse, because her response to having that pain before was also going to OCD rituals, just made it even worse. But so real events, yeah, when we're talking about living with uncertainty, it's irrelevant. We're treating everything as real. And again, everything is just a statistical probability. So real events might be more likely, but it doesn't matter. How am I going to cope with what happened? If something really awful happened to me, and my approach to it is that ruined my life, everything would have been different, I will agree that it might have been a tragic event. But the alternative reality of what would life be like without it is a fantasy. It might have been better. It actually might have been worse. We don't know. The best any of us can do is, how am I going to cope with what happens next? Success. I think that I speak in fluent cliche. So success is not making the right decision. It's coping with the consequences of whatever decision you made. I'm not saying it's going to work out, but our only choice is, what do I do next, whether it worked out or not. It's not like, oh, you shouldn't have done that. Where am I going next? So real event OCD, it's not a different thing. I think when people ask that question, they're pretending that when you and I talk about uncertainty, that we're just really faking it. We're just saying, oh yeah, when you have this messed up problem, but real events, oh my gosh, what do we do with that? The same thing.
100%. And I love, the fact that it is no different. And actually, I think most OCD is based in real events somehow, right? Yeah. Like it's always based in some sort of perceived real risk that exists. And I think for some reason we think, well, if this situation actually happened and now OCD is latching onto it, it makes it different. Why? Like, no, it doesn't. It's no different than a situation that could happen, yeah, or a fear of an outcome that may or may not be there. It's all the same.
Yeah, if I'm afraid of getting cancer, treatment's going to be, how will you cope with cancer if you get it? And the only difference between that and really having cancer is, one, you might actually die, and the other, you're not dying yet. But we're doing the same treatment.
Right.
Because if you're dying, again, how do you want that last 2 years to be? Do you want it to be as good as it can be, or do you want it to be extra miserable?
It's your choice. So Sam at 11:15 said, I've learned once I stop doing my homework, OCD comes back. I get better by stopping mental compulsions, such as trying to solve the thoughts, and stop the physical compulsions like acting out. So I think the question here that I'll turn this into a question is really how do we transition from feeling like we always have to do homework, and if we don't, OCD comes back? Like, what does that tell you? What as a clinician does that make you think?
I have really for 30 years unsuccessfully lost the weight that I should lose. And my wife had told me an actual terrible thing about this because one day she said to me, you don't lose the weight because you don't want it badly enough. And I really wanted to argue, except I knew exactly what I was doing wrong, so she was right. And if I go on a diet, it's not temporary. Like, I lose the weight and then I can go back to eating the way I want. So it's normal for all humans when we have a long-term behavior that we're trying to work on, that we can slip back. And as you would point out, it's not like this means relentless, everyday, painful exposure. But it does mean, yeah, it's useful for me to stay on top of it, because yes, I can slip back. It's very seductive. I've seen a lot of people when they have OCD and they're really doing exposure and dealing with uncertainty well, and then they get a good period and they really treasure the good period, which that's fine. I want you to enjoy it. But the response is like, I can't lose this. I got to make sure I don't lose this. And so one of the ways I'm not going to lose this, if something comes back, I don't want that to interfere, so I start to avoid and do things to make sure it doesn't, I basically start ritualizing again to make sure that I don't slip back and forget that I had to work my way out of it. If I want to stay in good physical shape, I don't get to stop exercising. I think one way in which you get to be really lucky in having OCD and treating OCD, for you, it's effortless to have to think about uncertainty every day, because every day that's what you talk about. Yep. So you're not doing it to have therapy, but every day you're thinking about living with uncertainty in a gazillion different ways. And I think, somebody else, they need some way to keep thinking about it, that it is affecting every part of life. And I think that's one nice thing about, being able to, for people to be able to come and listen to these shows. I think it's a way of like keeping yourself honest, because I think, rather than having something creep up, it's like, oh, there it is, or if there's a good support group around, it's like a way of not beginning to slowly slip back without realizing what's going on.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think that, it's about the choice to make uncertainty part of your everyday life, right? Whether you want to call it ERP or uncertainty, I don't really care, right? But yes, you can't do it in a bubble, right? You can't come to our treatment facility here in Houston and I can treat you intensely for 8 to 10 weeks and you go home and never have to worry about it again, right? Do I hope that you go home and you don't have to worry about it the way you did before you came? Of course, right? And I hope that, but it's become a part of your lifestyle, right? Again, I use the diet analogy all the time, because the reality is that I can work really hard to lose 20 or 50 pounds and lose it. But if I revert back to my old behaviors, I'm not going to keep it off, right? So it's the same thing. But it shouldn't have to feel, in my opinion, like this daily list of dreadful homework every day, right? That's the big difference, is that if we have bought into it as a lifestyle and uncertainty as the model for our entire treatment, it becomes second nature, right? It becomes innate.
Can I do a Buddhist parable? Pema Chodron, Buddhist nun, who I think of as the nice version of me. She describes this woman running away from tigers. And the woman comes to a cliff and there's a vine there, and she climbs halfway down the vine, and it turns out there are tigers at the bottom, tigers at the top, and there's a mouse gnawing on the vine. And next to her is a strawberry bush. And as soon as I see there's a strawberry bush, I'm going, oh, right, Buddhist nun, yeah, she's going to say, eat the strawberry. And I'm thinking, really? I'm hanging on a vine with tigers above and below in the mouse line. I am not eating any damn strawberry. And then she goes on to say that this parable is life. The outcome for this woman is definite. She's going to die. She just doesn't know when. So hematogen thinks like, under that circumstance, you'll think, oh, okay, I'm gonna eat the strawberry, and I'm still not eating the strawberry because I'm sorry, I got that below, above and below me, and I'm just not convinced. Then I imagined, what if I'm hanging on that vine for 5 hours? And if we just sit here quietly for a little bit. That was 15 seconds. Imagine 5 hours. That would be so boring. You know what? I'm probably going to go for that strawberry, and I'm going to eat it slow, because after that strawberry, I've got nothing. So imagine I reach out and pluck the strawberry, and as I pluck it, it falls from my hands onto the ground. God, that sucks. So I think living with uncertainty. She says, if you understand uncertainty, your first response should be terror. But after that, it's like it helps you live in the present, because that's the closest you have to reality. Past is a hope, past are memories, future's a hope, and all you have is the present, unless you have OCD, and then you have nothing. So I think it gets us closer to having what we can, enjoying our children, loving when we're with them. That seems to be a good motivation.
Go for the strawberry. So there was one comment I was just reading that we'll wrap up with, and it was, do you have any suggestions for getting past stuck points? Sometimes the stuck points in particular are hearing about other people talking about the years it took them to get to treatment, but maybe they're still in their 20s, and this individual feeling like being much later in life and feeling like they've missed so much life, and feeling really kind of frustrated or upset about their ability to recover maybe in their 50s, 60s, 70s.
Well, I do think coping with that, I did get to miss things that I can't have, can be very difficult. But the really good thing about OCD is it doesn't really seem that either severity or how long I've had it affect outcomes. So I have plenty of people who lost 30 or 40 years recover quickly. Unfortunately, the support group I run is filled. Fortunately, but unfortunately for them, my support group is filled with people who didn't get the right treatment for that long. So, yes, I have to deal with what I lost, but in the ideal, we want to help the person get to start living now. What I lost doesn't mean I can't start living.
Absolutely. At any age. I've seen it happen at 80 years old, and sometimes it's the best ability for them to go enjoy the rest of life and for us to see what that's like. And I think that there are a lot of people who get treatment early on, but it doesn't mean that they have freedom either, right? Treatment might not be the right treatment. It may not be the way they view it, or a lot of us can accept treatment as being good enough. And so sometimes freedom at 80 is better than some people who may not ever get it, right? And it's important to look. I've just always been a big believer of like, I can look in the rearview mirror, but is that really helpful, right? Versus looking at what's in front of me or what's ahead. So I know it's been an hour. Thank you so much, as always, John. It's always a pleasure. I think the takeaways from today are us really thinking about buying in to the true treatment for OCD, right? Really thinking about, why should you take this risk? Dr. Grayson laid out a couple points. One, maybe you don't have a choice. Two, what have you lost to OCD? How is it hurting you or your family? Or three, do your rituals even work, right? And all of those are reasons that should point us back to, yes, we should always take the risk, because the reward is freedom. And what I'll tell you is that without taking the risk, freedom isn't achievable. So you have to choose what you want to have. in how you want to get there. The amazing news is that while today might have been great, it was limited to an hour. This Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, you can attend the International OCD Foundation Conference to be able to get more skills in practical ways that you can start your path to freedom from OCD. Thank you for everyone for attending. And thank you as always, John. We appreciate all of your insight and having you on every time we get to.
Thank you, Liz. It's always a pleasure.
My pleasure. And to everyone, remember, help and hope are always available. See you next time.